Welcome to Axis. This is where we come together with subject matter experts to discuss some of the most riveting issues of our times. Today, I will be joined here with Miss Oksana Boyko. She is a senior journalist at Russia Today. First of all, Miss, thank you so much for joining us, but allow me to introduce you further that she is one of those people who has interviewed high profile speakers as former Prime Minister of Pakistan Imran Khan, former President of Turkey Abdullah Gül, former National Security Advisor of US John Bolton, and many others to her credit. Along with that, she currently hosts Worlds Apart at Russia Today, where she is known for her straightforward questions and deep knowledge on many of the subjects. She has also years of experience as a reporter on Russian politics and foreign policy as part of the presidential and foreign ministries' press pools. She's also a war correspondent, having covered on the ground conflicts in Syria, Libya, Georgia, and South Ossetia, along with many others. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out the time. It's a pleasure to host you at
Be with you.
Axis.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, with your experience as a journalist, what boggles today's, a lot of the incidents that happen today, they're being reported in the media. We see an information landscape emerge with, digital platforms like Twitter, Telegram, WhatsApp emerge. So, one then wonders, what is the geopolitics of narratives? And first and foremost, you're from Russia, and there's a lot of mystique across the world. Now, maybe that's just projected by Western media, or perhaps it's just people in other countries not taking as much interest to understand the media landscape within Russia. So, first of all, perhaps if you can sort of lead us into understanding the role of media in shaping perceptions generally and your experience, and also perhaps guide us, how does Russian media function with regards to state-controlled versus independent journalism?
Well, thank you for the question. It takes me back all the way to my student years as a journalist student, both in Russia, and I later on studied mass communications on the US State Department scholarship in the United States. And I think the way you phrase this question, meaning absolutely no criticize, but I think it's a rather Western narrative or Western
Exactly,
frame
absolutely agreed.
Perceiving the media, because I think what now, at least in Russia, and I think increasingly around the world, we understand is that media is just one lens through which we view the world. And in order for this view to be balanced, you also have to have history. You also have to have, I think at least, some sort of spirituality or religion. You also have to have some sort of tradition and being embedded within your society and understanding what your collective is all about, what values are present there. And you also need to understand yourself and what you like, what you dislike, what are your values, ingrained values, not something that is being put on you socially, but something that you believe deep in your heart, something that you would not part with even at the encounter with death. And when all of that comes together, I think you can treat media for what it's supposed to be. That is a medium to inform you about what's happening around the world. Back in the days when I was a student, there was still a distinction between news and analysis. And there was a respect of boundary between the two. I think in this day and age, many people, especially many people in the Western world, but not only in the Western world, because I think the Western culture and the Western morality, the Western worldview is very pervasive. It's very much encroaching onto the rest of the world, because people in the rest of the world still treat the West as this beacon of enlightenment. And because of that, they sort of see their own perception of things in favor of the Western frames. But I think nowadays, for the most part, it all came down to the mantra of perception is reality. And I think in Russia, it's a very conscious and principled stance against in favor of the Oh, I have somebody here, sorry,
Oh my
in
God, I
favor of
absolutely
the
love that.
of the opposite, because I think reality trumps perception, and it's not only a conscious stance. I think it's also a spiritual stance, because reality is God, regardless of how you define God, of how you define the transcendental.
Okay.
You have to have respect for it, and from that comes respect for the truth, and respect for your own perception of things, and secondary to that, respect to you know the difference of opinions that may exist. Sorry for this long-winded answer, but you started off with a very philosophical and historical lens.
Actually, this helps me because I do have a lot of questions along those lines. The discussion on narratives naturally becomes something that you have to, identify the truth from falsehood. What is the truth? How does postmodernism affect it, and what not? And I will come to some of those topics as well. And I'm glad that you highlighted that. But before we move on to that, and since I read that you were also a war correspondent, I really want to understand, when you're in the zone on the ground with so much conflict going on, and you've covered some of the deadliest, regions as well, but now there's a war going on in Ukraine as well, right? And at the same time, we're seeing the Middle East engulf in another very terrible, conflict between Israel and its onslaught on the Palestinian people. So, what really motivates a journalist to go on the front line to, gather all that information? And, what exactly does a journalist do on ground? And I understand that the main job of a journalist is to, inform people, as you mentioned. But through war journalism, then and now, what sort of differences do you see? And perhaps you could also highlight how you see the Ukraine war being highlighted across the globe, and how does, the Russian state, does it have anything to do with regards to perception management? We hear a lot about disinformation as well. So, your thoughts on some of these points?
Well, I suggest we split them into two questions. Let me first address the general question about what uh, takes a journalist to a war zone. And I'll try to be very frank with you. And apart from being a journalist, I'm also very interested in psychology, both individual and collective psychology. And it is well known psychologically that whenever you come very close to death, there's also a lot of life present. And I think that's the main attraction for journalists. And I've met many of them around the world in the war zones, of coming to a war zone. At least it used to be in the past, because I have to add a caveat here. I have not covered the Ukrainian war from the ground. I covered it analytically from a studio, from press conferences, but not from the ground. In Libya, in Syria, I was there, like in the midst of things. And it was a very interesting, a dangerous, but also a very, well, existential to some extent experience, because at least back in the days, let's say in the Libyan conflict, uh, usually communication networks were severed in the first days. And what you do as a journalist is you just walk around, film your stories, find a way to feed them somehow to the newsroom. And it is my particular predilection. I am very interested in human psyche, and I usually try to show it like what's happening through the lens of ordinary life, because I think in this day and age, people have sort of subverted hierarchies. They believe that politics and high offices of power are what's the most important, and I think it's the other way around. I think we all exist in this world to live grounded human life, and everything else should be sort of brought together to help people do that, to raise their children to be good members of their society, to live productive lives, to practice what they preach, to actually practice what they preach and what they believe in. And I think in many wars, it was a very painful clash between some abstract ideas about what life is supposed to be, and a total disregard for everyday reality of life. I will give you an example, for example, from the Libyan conflict, when in a matter of weeks, Muammar Gaddafi went from being somebody who is like whose portrait is on every wall in every house, to his portraits being thrown on the, on the floor to be used as carpets to clean your shoes.
Oh God.
But it was a very, like, I understand emotionally why the reaction was like this, but it also meant for many people the total sort of collapse of their everyday life. They couldn't get the medicine, they couldn't get the food, the security went absolutely horrible. Women were not able to, get out on the streets safely, and that country, the leader is gone. His portraits are on the floor to clean the shoes, but the actual reality of life is lost for, like, I don't know, I hope not forever, but for many years.
Hmm.
That does answer to a very large extent. And of course, the information that comes in from a person who's on ground is very different from someone who's sitting, back at home and, delivering on it. And so I often wonder what has happened to perhaps, the level of journalism now, because people are now moving towards social media platforms with the idea of citizen journalism. And as you mentioned that your stories were about showing through the lens of ordinary people, and that's like an art. Storytelling itself is an art, and a very strong form of strategically communicating ideas as well. So that also then brings me to the question then, how has the rise of digital media and social platforms then influenced the geopolitical spread of narratives? How does that, come into play with regards to misinformation and disinformation? Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in order to answer your question, we need to differentiate between various strains of this umbrella term that you mentioned, journalism, because when I was on the ground, I was a reporter.
Okay.
I was a reporter going from one place to another, and I was like, my goal there was to bring a feel of the place, a feel of the experience that people go through to larger audiences. This is one sort of side of the profession. If you're sitting in the studio, it's also valuable, but you are approaching it from a totally different vantage point. You are trying to analyze big trends, which is also, as I said, a valuable thing to do, but it's not exactly the reporting from the ground. And I think where manipulation comes in is when you try to sort of mix those various vantage points. Because if I'm a foreign reporter, which I saw many times, Western reporters, CNN reporters coming to Libya and essentially through themselves telling what people on the ground think, well, this is a manipulation, because and you can easily find, like cherry picked people who will tell you your own position or your own view of what they think. But if you're really honest with yourself, with the soul inside you, with your own deeper values, you can get into the locale, like into the place, and allow the story to be told. And if those things always emerge, like as a psychologist, like on the side, as somebody who likes that field, I believe in synchronicities, and I think that concept also exists in many religions. That if you're truly honest, life will manifest itself, and it will bring your way many interesting stories. And if you're honest with that, you can bring it about, and you present it for what it is, people's experiences. When you present your analysis, you say, this is my analysis, this is what I think through my own lenses, and my own lenses include my political position, my ethnic and national position, my cultural background, my being a woman, a mother, and whatever else. I mean, we all have many identities, but I think it's very dangerous and actually very presumptuous, and to me it's a moral sin to presume that you know what's best for the others and to speak in their name without even bothering to give them their own voice to speak. Because when you go to these various places, especially war-torn places, people there are very rarely concerned about high-minded ideas of whom the American president wants to lead their country. They're concerned about medicine, they're concerned about getting food, they're concerned about safety, they're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about money. And all of those issues are not trifles. They're valid concerns. They are just as valid as high-minded politics, perhaps even more. And if you respect that, if you respect those differentiations, you don't get into trouble. I think we only get into trouble when people oftentimes deliberately try to mix up those fields.
You bring me to, to ask you then, can media truly achieve objectivity then? Because you've sort of shared that how, people can add on to their biases or their perspectives when delivering these reports or, giving out information by that regard. So does it not, become naturally that bias is inherently part of, this particular space? Is it possible then to be objective in, especially when it comes to reporting on sensitive issues that may affect one state or the other?
Well, the word objective is a very loaded term for me. I'm thinking about objective reality. Objective reality is a godly reality. I am a believer in a, supernatural. I mean, I believe in the higher spirit, and I think it's only the higher spirit that knows everything. He's omnipotent and omniscient. I think everybody else is a human being, and he needs to be or she needs to be humble about that human nature, and that includes a recognition that this is my perspective. And if I'm honest with myself and with my
Okay.
audience that this is my perspective, then I can translate it with integrity. I can transmit it rather with integrity, and I can also have respect for the perspective of the other, including my adversary. I think this
Okay.
is also very important. Like, you can actually treat adversaries with respect. This is, a very long-term theme in Russian history and Russian culture, that you need to give respect to the adversaries for your own sake, because it's never a win-win. We all live in a intermingled, like interconnected world, that even if you win the battle today, if your adversary is too bitter, you will have to face it again. So it's foolish to try to, secure or freeze history once and for all. History never ends, whatever the American ideologues believe. It's an ongoing process. It will only end when the Almighty, or when the Creator decides to put an end to it. But to your point, I think no, it's not possible to achieve objectivity. I think it's even dishonest to strive
Okay.
towards it, but it is possible to be balanced. It is possible to be clear about where your point of view comes from, and
Mhm.
that also, that informs the audience about your own biases or limitations or your own subjectivity, and allows them to extract something that you share, because there is a consensual reality that we can all agree upon. And if you're serving that reality, you can do that in an authentic and genuine way. I believe at least that.
Miss Oksana, you're loaded with a lot of philosophical, senses here, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have this conversation. And you bring me to a point where one of the book's active measures, Thomas Reid very eloquently talks about, the goal of disinformation being one that puts emotion over analysis, and therefore bias over what we would call a balanced perspective, division over unity. And what's happening these days is essentially just an extended form of what active measures are. Disinformation is perhaps even more deadlier than before. And media, intelligence ops, and all of these things have been going on since Cold War and so on. And we're only seeing how all of these issues are now being compounded with the advancement of the digital landscape and how geopolitics is evolving within the digital realm as well. So I want to understand then, for Russia specifically, and in your own experience as well, how the rise of disinformation campaigns has essentially influenced Russia's positions in its foreign affairs or foreign policy dimensions, or how has that impacted actors within the media like yourself to combat it, or pursue a proactive approach to deal with these issues, especially when it comes to influencing foreign policies or just the national interest of Russia itself within the region.
Well, it's thank you for the question. It's also a pretty heavy one. I will start by saying that I think when my channel RT was created, I think it was in 2004. I've been with it for a pretty long time already. I think the initial aim was to play on the in the Western media landscape on Western terms. And what I mean by that is that I think, at least in cultural terms and strategic terms as well, Russia and the West have two different approaches. Russians are known for what is being called a positional strategy. We usually play sort of black pieces in chess. We are number two. We are responsive and reactive. We rarely take a proactive stance. And that has deep roots in Russian history, simply because, I mean, we fought most of our wars throughout centuries in that way, simply because Russia is a very large country, relatively scarcely populated, so we cannot afford offensive strategy. And it's not only in war fighting, it's also in communications. If you look at, for example, Western parliaments, there are people going after each other very directly, you know, accusing themselves in very like humiliating terms, but you know, a day later they could be making deals behind the scenes. That's very common for Western strategy. It's like very combative approach in not only in war fighting, but also in communications. And I think when we started, we tried to do the same, you know, like fighting, being straightforward, asking, you know, questions that we really have or questions that others don't ask. And very soon we discovered that, you know, for many in Western media, it's a form rather than a substance. If you try to use that form for the content that Western powers do not approve of, you quickly become what's labeled an agent of disinformation, which in their parlance means an information that they don't like, or information that they would like to suppress, or information that they don't want their audiences to be disseminated amongst, because they don't want their people to actually make their own conclusions. So as a result of that, I think we were very very fastly taking off many airwaves in Western countries. Right now, we are expanding in other parts of the world, English language parts of the world. At least I'm speaking for RT International, places like Asia, Africa, in some parts of Europe. But I think we are also trying to do that both as a channel and to some extent as a country in a in a in a way that is more consistent with our historical way of being. That is, again, being in a positional strategy. We do not react for the sake of reacting, but we do try to bring in a longer view, because, again, life and the substance of life, politics, including geopolitics, are not for the sake of fighting. They're actually for the sake of making lives for people around the world better. And for that, you need analysis, you need the perception of history, you need the perception of your own justice, as well as justice for other people. And the most important thing, I think you need to treat others as you yourself want to be treated, and to
Absolutely.
have that inbuilt humility, not as a moral value, I want to stress that, but as a means of survival, because everybody else, every other culture, every other nation comes from its own perspective, with their own historical experiences, with their own challenges, and with their own achievements. And they always know what's best for them. We can meet in some mid-level and negotiate. And for that, you need respect. For that, you cannot come and say, okay, I know what's best for you in Pakistan, simply because, I mean, even if I say that, it means nothing. It's just empty rhetoric.
Absolutely.
That makes sense because Pakistan also understands when it gets bitten by, perception management across, global media. We've seen how that has happened. Also, there was a lot of flashback in the early days of the Ukraine war when, a lot of the biases from the Western media were coming across when it came to identifying Ukrainian refugees versus, people coming in from conflicts from the Middle East, and a lot of whitewashing on that end was happening, and countries like Pakistan were speaking heavily against that. And you've raised a very important point on that matter, that you have to give respect, show respect as you would want yourself to be treated on these platforms. And so moving a little bit towards the softer element of narratives in media, I would lastly ask you then, with all the hard talk that happens, right, and that's essentially important analysis, logic, all of that, on the softer element, what role do you think Russian media perhaps is pursuing with regards to its image on the other side of the world, because Russia is now opening up to Asia. We're seeing channels of trade being opened up across different countries. Pakistan wants to be closer to Russia too, albeit all the issues that exist within that, for Pakistan largely. But I would like to understand, from a public diplomacy perspective, how do you see Russian media sort of progressing its soft power element through media? And that would be my conclusive question to you, ma'am.
Thank you for the question. It's, I mean, all the questions are pretty deep and philosophical. I think, at least as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not speaking for all of the Russian media, I speak for
Of
myself.
course, it's your perspective.
I think what Russia can bring to Pakistan, especially, and to many other countries, is this experience and sense of accepting itself for what it is,
Okay.
accepting its own very difficult history, accepting that sometimes you need to make very, very difficult decisions, and that includes the war in Ukraine. Because I mean, this is the last thing any of us could have imagined. You know, my last name is Boyko. I'm half Ukrainian. I have family there, and it's, you know, heart-wrenching to have my mom speak to her brother in Odessa at a time when, you know, he has an ability to, first of all, his phone is charged because they don't have electricity, and you can also hear the bombardments going there. I do want to add a caveat here that Russia fighting this war and accepting that war is one of the most horrible ways of conducting politics and policy. Nonetheless, Russia does do it within substantial humanitarian constraints. Our government, our military forces are targeting military targets. And this is
There's
very
no denying
important.
that,
And this is not a
absolutely.
point of propaganda. This
Mm.
is important for strategic and influence reasons, because we understand that we will have to live with the Ukrainians
Mm-hmm.
side by centuries. And we want people on the ground not hate us more than they can hate us. I'm not talking about respect here, because I think it's still extremely difficult. I mean, when your city is being bombarded, even if it's military installations, you
Mm-hmm.
still fear for your life, for your children. So it's not realistic to expect that they would understand the sensibilities of the Russian politics. But I think that's also important for collective and national self-perception, to understand that you are who you are, what
Mm-hmm.
your interests are, what are the means you are going to use, and to be fully conscious of the means that you are using, and not to try to embellish yourself in the eyes of others. I think we are totally chill right now on the self-perception in the Western sort of side of the world, because it was never fair to us, and it would not be fair for competitive reasons. I
At
mean,
any
for
time, yeah.
cynical, influential reasons. But we also believe that you know, other people, if they're honest with themselves, they can um, they can sort of relate to the integrity of the Russian position. And I guess this is what the word that I want to bring here: integrity, not only to others, but also to yourself. And you know, there was an interesting thought that I had yesterday, that at this point of time, Russia is far more interested in dealing with the so-called traditional or developing societies, because those societies are still societies where humanity in the traditional sense still resides. It's societies that are connected through family values, through culture, through traditions, societies where the fabric of life, the
Mm-hmm.
fabric of the collective still exists. And with such societies, it's easier for Russia to do business, because they honor war, they honor, you know, trifle issues like the quality of life, the
Mm-hmm.
actual quality of life for the society, rather than the, you know, a selected few capitalists who make a lot of money while the rest of their society lingers in poverty. So I think maybe we are also bringing a totally different definition of progress, and what progress is, and what self-respect in collective and individual terms is: accepting yourself for who you are, taking responsibility for your own life and for your own actions, and extending that to others as well.
Why, thank you, Miss Boyko. You know, you've added more questions in my head while you've answered a lot of my questions. But of course, this was my conclusive question to you. And lastly, if there's a particular message that you would like to give perhaps to Pakistani audience with regards to, how they perceive Russia generally. Because when I talk about, when I engage with different people from different countries, one of the idea is to perhaps build connection. And what sort of connection would you like to see with regards to Russia and Pakistan? And with that, we will be ending our session.
Well, I've been covering Pakistan quite closely. I think it's a very interesting country for me personally, simply because I have a personal interest in Sufism, and you have a lot of interesting Islamic sites in the country. But as for the political or let's say intergovernmental or international ties, I think what's important is not uh, thinking about it in terms of unions or being closer or being further apart. I think we all have to come to terms with who we are collectively or nationally, and deal with each other in a mature way. You know, you have your interest, we have our interest. There's China, there's India, there are many other countries in the neighborhood, but we all have something, some shared interest that unite us naturally. It's not a matter of morality; it's a matter of just practical common interest, which includes security, which include economic development, education. Well, perhaps tourism. I'm biased about that because I do like people to travel more, learn about each other's cultures.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, there is a lot of interest in Russia towards Pakistan, but I think it's also one of the reasons for that is I think Pakistan is also going through these growing pains of trying to understand who you are as a nation, because you sort of, whenever I speak with the Pakistani audiences, there's always a question of how Pakistan is being depicted in the Western media. There's a lot of gripe about that. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is how you perceive yourself inside yourself, what you think about yourself. And if there's enough integrity and self-respect there, you can deal with whoever, Russia, Ukraine, the United States, China. It doesn't matter, because you will be interacting with those countries from your own sort of center, spiritual, historical, cultural center. And I think that's the most valuable in any international interaction.
Exactly, Ms. Boyko. And let's hope that Pakistan, along with many other countries, are able to work on their national power, their cohesive identity, and are able to be resilient against all the geopolitical happenings that are going on across the world. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure engaging with you in this conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. This was
Thank you
Access.
very much. Thank you for the invitation, and best of luck.
Thank you. We will see you again in another episode of Access.